Thanks very much. Good morning. Blimey. There was nobody here when I sat down at the front, and now it's full. That's great. Paul Jackson, I'm an analyst from Ovum, which is one of the big industry analyst firms. And I get the pleasure of looking at new and wacky stuff. So VR, AR, AI, drones, things like that. All the stuff which could develop into massive markets, but at the moment is largely hype. What I'm going to do very quickly this morning is go through where we think the market's going and maybe give you some guidance as to how to use the numbers and the forecasts you're going to hear over the next 2 days, and there will be a lot, and they will all be different, to help you form your opinions about where to go in VR in particular. So, back to basics to start off with. I'll zip through this because we're all probably an expert audience here. VR, AR. Similar headset technology, similar processing, 3D rendering, similar underlying software if you're using Unity or something like that. Where they really start to split up is when you look at the applications. Because VR is fully immersive, you're probably not going to want to be using it 8 hours a day for working. You're probably not going to be wanting to watch full-length videos in it. You probably not want to collaborate with people in a VR headset. AR is great at that kind of stuff. And we define AR, particularly immersive AR, as you are seeing the real world and things are being projected onto it. So you're not just using a front-facing camera and seeing a film of the real world, it's the real world, which is where obviously HoloLens, Magic Leap, and some of the Epson solutions you'll hear about later come into play. VR is a very interesting consumer market, and that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this deck. AR, this form of AR at least, is still largely in the lab. Magic Leap hasn't announced anything. HoloLens is ridiculously expensive for developers. They use similar tools, though, so what you gain in knowledge in VR is largely applicable to AR, and ultimately, I do agree with some of those numbers earlier on, AR will be a much bigger market because it's more broadly applicable and it's for use in business and enterprise. Also mentioned already, VR has been with us for quite a long time, but only really got any good, well, depends what you class as any good, this year and into people's hands this year. The growth really happens in these next 4 years, which is where we start getting into forecasts, data, predictions. This is my data and predictions caveat here. There's very little actual data available for VR, and there's none at all available for immersive AR. We as analysts spend most of our time thinking about these numbers and putting together forecasts, but they are basically forecasts. They are assumptions in numbers. So when you see these different numbers, which will all add up to different totals or measure different things, do a couple of things. Look at the scale that the market's getting to by, say, 2020. Look at what's happening in terms of types of content, what's being successful, what's lagging behind. Most importantly, start to look at, if there's a regional breakdown, where those opportunities are hitting first. Okay, so having said, be cautious of the numbers, here are some numbers. This is what we're seeing in terms of headsets. So by 2020, we predict about 1/3 of a billion headsets globally, largely driven by mobile smartphone VR headsets, which will probably be about 4 generations down the line from what we have today, given the speed of smartphone innovation. You will still see the dedicated VR headsets, the high-end stuff, but that will have moved on a generation or so as well to stay ahead of mobile. Still be a huge number of those promotional headsets out there as well, many of them gathering dust in drawers, but also some which people use occasionally for family videos, stuff that gets shared on Facebook and the like. So that's the hardware picture. Won't surprise you that if you look at that mobile space, China is highly dominant in that space, as is the new category of the, like what Facebook demoed last week, the dedicated mobile headset. Not using a smartphone, but not tethered either. That's going to be a big category that's starting to emerge in 2017. The hardware's great, but people aren't going to use it if there's nothing interesting to do with it. So my area of interest in particular is the software and the applications. So this is the global total for VR content spend by consumers for the next 4 or 5 years. We top off at around 15 billion by 2020. And the interesting thing is the three types, fairly obvious. Games, which would also include interactive experiences like Everest VR. And if you seek out one demo you haven't seen yet, and you haven't seen Everest VR, go and see that on the Vive. It's very, very impressive. Video and apps, stuff that isn't either video or games. That's big screen there, which is a sort of a screen sharing app. Gaming starts off biggest this year. People are buying the PlayStation VR headset like crazy. They'll have an attach of 2 or 3 games to that. That's already an additional $100 in addition to that headset that that person's spending. Comparatively, to buy video, you really have to search. There are a couple of sort of movies out there. There are some short stories, but much of it is short promotional demos. No new revenue there at all. And the apps market will be a nice little fill-up at the end. There may be some communications apps in there as well if people charge for them. Put those together in terms of revenue, just for consumers, just for VR, and you get to something which is approaching 27, 28 billion by 2020. Hardware leading, and then content taking over around 2018, both as the hardware prices decrease, but also as more of that content and more of those marketplaces and app stores are actually available. We have reams of depth on that by regions, by types of headset. Come and ask me afterwards if you're interested in getting more of a breakdown in that. Those numbers broadly tie with what you saw in the first presentation, because that was the all-up market. This is just consumer and just VR, but they're broadly in line, so that's a good start to the day in terms of 2 different forecasts. Just want to finish up with some winners and losers, because that's what we like to predict as analysts. So, winners, he looks happy. We'll call him a winner. Obviously, the people who are building the actual headsets and building the content. There's already a number of companies, we saw some of them mentioned before, that are doing this very successfully, certainly in terms of the amount of press they're generating, if not revenue. And ultimately, many of those will go on to have a success and get some of that $30 billion by 2020. What we haven't seen yet is true platforms emerge, or at least across device platforms. And obviously those big gorilla-type companies are the ones which we see trying to play for this, whether that's Oculus or Google or Valve or people like Razer. Those guys will be the ones that popularize app stores, marketplaces, transferring content between 2 different headsets if you've bought it once, things like that. That's very important. That is what Apple was so brilliant at with the iPhone, was bringing that app store to the device and making it easy to spend small amounts of money on content and apps. Mobile operators have a great opportunity to capitalize on the hype, particularly with those cheap headsets that they can give away. Some of them will go further. They will open content stores. Orange is doing this already to a degree. But the big winners in terms of that video piece will probably be those multi-channel firms. By this, I mean people like Sky. I mean people like Comcast. I mean people like Netflix. The guys that can probably produce some VR content, and it's very cheap to produce VR video, and maybe charge $1 or $2 extra to their subscribers for a couple of years until it becomes the norm to supply that. So those guys already have billing relationships, and they can build that into their future business model. Social platforms, we've already talked about what Facebook's trying to do in this space. There will be others that will try and mirror and copy that, and the advantage of those social VR videos will give them an edge. And finally, venue owners. I'm going to come back to that one on my last slide. Losers. I'm sure we all remember Sad Keynote in Johnny Mnemonic. Not necessarily a loser, but, you know, not a very good film, that's for sure. Infrastructure providers. And by this, interesting point here, I mean infrastructure providers to consumers. Consumers aren't going to pay more for their broadband just so they can use VR. In the same way, they don't pay more for their broadband to play games or stream Netflix or do any of those other bandwidth-consuming tasks. Along with the second guys, the telcos, who will try and operate walled gardens for content, because they always do, they're going to face the same problem they've always had, which is being the best damn pipe they can and not getting any money for any content or services above and beyond that pipe. Now, the differentiation here is obviously they're still going to have to build out that infrastructure for VR, and that's where the infrastructure providers for those guys, like Huawei, could really do a very, very nice level of business. There's too many VR hardware manufacturers. There's too many people vying to be platforms. We expect that to shrink, not grow, in the next 2 to 3 years. And we will start to see vertical niches emerging, like what Starbreeze is doing in more of the venue VR space. And in terms of gaming, interactive experience, it's interesting. If you look at that video number, 8 billion, that's additive. Nobody is not going to the cinema to watch a VR film. People are watching a film in the cinema and then may get the 15-minute VR making of as well. So it's additive. Gaming, it's probably substitutional. I was going to buy Call of Duty, but a new game's come out on the PlayStation VR, I'll buy that instead. So if you're not doing VR content, it's not going to bankrupt you, but it could be slivering a couple of percentage points off your revenue. And I'm afraid it's another nail in the coffin for camera manufacturers. They've already been very hard hit by smartphones, and now we're seeing that transition from smartphones to 360 cameras, VR cameras, often made by the smartphone firms, that are drawing in, again, those younger consumers that want to make those 360 videos for their social network groups. Finally, things to watch out for. I said I'd come back to this. All those numbers were related to direct consumer spending, buying hardware, buying software. First of all, there's a whole bunch of people around the world who can't afford to buy a headset. That will mean the rebirth of things like the internet cafe, only the VR cafe. You will also see collaboration spaces where people can use this kind of technology in a contained environment. More interesting, potentially, is the theme park space. You're already seeing some theme park rides which use VR. You're going to see many more over the next couple of years, and some big firms entering that space very, very soon. And finally, you're also seeing cinema being hit in two ways. IMAX are rolling out VR cinemas with Starbreeze, and there's also a bunch of film companies who are putting VR demo pods in cinema lobbies with VR trailers, making-ofs, interviews with the cast, things like that. So these are all out of the home, but they're still applications for consumers. This is fascinating. Light field photography, which had a sort of initial burst 2 or 3 years ago with the Litro camera. This is a form of photography which is basically computational. So you capture all the data, and you can focus the image wherever you want later in post-production. As you imagine, it generates a lot of data. That's now being moved on to be array cameras. So if you can imagine a box that big filled with those cameras which have infinite focus, you're getting to a point whereby not only can you stream through a VR video scene, you can actually do what you do in the interactive experience, which is turn your head to the side and look round a corner. So this ultimately blurs the distinction between an interactive rendered Unity experience like Everest VR and a boxing match filmed with VR cameras. The two become, if not interchangeable, much closer, because you now have that degree of movement within the scene. Not total movement, although Intel's working on that as well, but certainly within a volume of space, you can move around using light field photography. And finally, I'm not going to labor this one, Magic Leap. We're all desperately interested to see when and what they announce. Some people have had demos and been sworn to secrecy. The last I heard, a product's probably still about 18 months out, but there will be major announcements next year, along with ongoing progress around HoloLens. This is AR, of course. So that's definitely a firm to watch with their $1 billion investment and sort of Silicon Valley cool. That was whistle stop, but I'm here for the next 2 days. If you've got any further questions, happy to take them then.